Welcome back to Episode 8, Season 2 of the Learning Curve podcast with Edmonton Catholic Schools. We're excited to have you back or to welcome you for the first time today. Our spotlight in this episode is on Dr. Tim Cusack, the Dean of Concordia University and one of the brilliant minds behind Leader Ready, a compelling book co-written with Vince Bustamante and published by Corwin. In today's interview, Dr. Cusack dives deep into leadership principles in education, teacher efficacy, and the critical role of assessment literate schools. Before we jump into the rich content ahead, let's pause for a moment of reflection. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Dear God, grant us your wisdom and guidance. May our words resonate with educators, inspiring classrooms filled with empathy and understanding. Bless us with patience and resilience as we navigate the journey of creating positive learning environments. In the spirit of growth and learning, we offer this prayer. Amen. With respect, we acknowledge that we are recording today on the traditional land of Treaty 6, the ancestral territory of Indigenous peoples. We pay tribute to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 4, and the enduring contributions of Indigenous communities. With gratitude, we honor their wisdom and resilience. As a united community, let's engage with the diverse peoples who call this land home. May our interactions be guided by positivity, celebrating the richness of Indigenous cultures, and working towards reconciliation through respect, empathy, and collaboration. May our journey be marked by humility, compassion, and a shared commitment to truth and understanding. Now let's dive into the agenda for today's episode. In Jennifer's Learning Lab, she explores the intriguing topic of mental rehearsal and visualization to elevate student performance. Our main guest, Dr. Tim Cusack, shares his wealth of knowledge on leadership principles, teacher efficacy, and fostering assessment literate schools. And lastly, Allison guides us through the Lit Literature segment, featuring the book Grading for Equity by Joe Feldman, offering profound insights into equitable grading practices. That's all for today. Let's jump right in.
Welcome to the Learning Lab, where we decode the brain's secrets of learning. We're on a mission for more success for more students, and sometimes that means leveraging principles from applied psychology. I'm your host, Jennifer Espejo-Harasimiak, ready to take you on a synaptic saunter through visualization and mental rehearsal. Consider Michael Phelps, the most decorated Olympian ever. His coach, Bob Bowman, had Phelps practice visualization techniques from a young age. Each night after physical training, Phelps would mentally rehearse his races, visualizing every stroke and turn. This mental training, a blend of visualization and mental rehearsal, is a cornerstone of his athletic success and a powerful tool in applied psychology. Visualization and mental rehearsal involve imagining ourselves performing a skill, engaging our brain in a rehearsal of the actual task. This process activates neural pathways similar to those used during the physical performance, effectively training our brain in the absence of physical action. In academics, this technique can be transformative. When students visualize and mentally rehearse academic tasks, they're not just daydreaming, they're laying the groundwork in their brains, activating neural pathways involved in learning and problem solving. This mental practice can enhance understanding, boost confidence, and improve focus. So how can we harness this technique for academic success? First, it's crucial to explain to students the science behind it, understanding that visualization is more than imagination, but a form of brain training, and it can be motivating. Next, guide students in creating vivid, multi-sensory mental images. Encourage them to incorporate not just visual, but also auditory, tactile, and even olfactory element. The more immersive the experience, the more effective the rehearsal. Then, have students perform mental rehearsals of academic tasks. Whether it's solving a math problem, writing an essay, or conducting a science experiment, practicing these skills in their minds can prepare them for the real thing. Encourage students to anticipate different scenarios during their mental rehearsals. What if a problem doesn't solve as expected? What alternative approaches can they take? This kind of rehearsal can reduce anxiety and stress, especially in uncertain or challenging situations. With that, dear listeners, let me leave you with one final point to ponder until our next episode. How do you envision using mental rehearsal and visualization in your classroom? Let us know in the comments.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Learning Curve podcast with Edmonton Catholic Schools. Today, we are thrilled to have a returning guest to the podcast, Dr. Tim Cusack, who is an experienced educator. He was our previous Deputy Superintendent with Leadership Support Services and currently is the Dean of Education at Concordia University. With over 30 years of experience in roles like teacher, principal, and assistant superintendent, he's passionate about leadership development. Tim also has a background as a naval warfare officer in the Royal Canadian Navy, and he shared his insights through presentations and his first book with Corwin, Leader Ready. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks very much, Julia. It's always wonderful to have an opportunity to chat with you.
Tell us about yourself and what brought you to education.
Yeah, that's a great question. So what brought me to education? I think as a young person, I was always involved in roles of service. So, for instance, I was in the Scouts Canada movement, and I loved working with other people, performing skits, doing activities, and that followed me as a young person into the Naval Reserve. So when I joined, the summer of grade 11, and here I am almost 40 years later. But those roles of service where I had opportunity to teach. And so what I found is I really enjoyed being a teacher, whether it was a lesson, a skill, whatever I was doing. And so I had finished my undergraduate degree as an English major, French minor at University of New Brunswick. And then I thought, I think I want to become a teacher. And so I went to Mount Allison University, my Bachelor of Education, and shortly thereafter was teaching in Northern Alberta for 5 years, then down in Brooks, Alberta for 4, and the Edmonton area for the past 20 plus years. There were times when I knew I wanted to be a classroom teacher. I wanted to have, a group of students that I got to work with day after day. And that said, as great as it is to be a teacher, it's still important to see ourselves as learners, as students of lifelong learning. And that has always resonated with me. So for me, I think what got me into education was that genuine desire to be a lifelong learner and to just serve the learning of children and the adults that I work alongside.
Lifelong learners standing out to me, and it seems like it's still inspiring you to this day to continue on in education, now being the dean of a university. Talk to us a bit about what a week in your life in your new role as dean, author, and consultant looks like.
Thanks. So in terms of Dean of Education at Concordia, the week can vary. So there's a set number of meetings, like, when I was Deputy Chief Superintendent, there were always the set of weekly meetings where you're engaging with your team, you're talking about what's coming up, you're looking at that sort of strategic visioning, and then more of the operational pieces of what's happening. What's important to me is to make meaningful time to connect with the students. So when our faculty is teaching, when our sessional instructors are teaching, is just to be present, ask the students how it's going, what they're doing, just to demonstrate that genuine interest in their learning, but also to ask them questions, what else they feel would be important or value added. So in terms of research opportunities, so there is a component of teaching, of research and service that's embedded within working at a university. And so the research piece, I'm really happy to have opportunities to do more intentional research into teaching and learning, particularly in looking at areas of leadership. And so also having the opportunity to connect with other faculties of education, other universities, and definitely maintaining strong partnerships with our K-12 organizations and school boards. So we have opportunity for external stakeholders to come in to help us inform our programming. So always it's through that lens of appreciative inquiry, as the dean, what are we doing that we should keep doing, but what are some of the areas in teaching, learning, assessment that we can be more intentional with, particularly in partnership with K-12. So how can we kind of have that handshake with K-12 and post-secondary to a greater degree to better understand what our pre-service and early year teachers need to have greater levels of success in their teaching?
From all these experiences, themes in assessment pedagogy are you seeing globally?
First, the work that I had an opportunity to work alongside consultants and teachers within Edmonton Catholic, for example, really looking at that assessment for learning, assessment of learning, assessment as learning. It's a very rich milieu in K to 12. And one of the things I noticed in post-secondary is perhaps there's still some more traditional mindsets in terms of what assessment is. When we think of the need, looking at formative and the importance of feedback and giving students feedback, so students really have a clear understanding of where they are in terms of their learning, and looking at progressions, just as we have our scope and sequence and our progressions in the K to 12 curriculum. So too do we have our outcomes in post-secondary courses, looking at more visible ways that high impact teaching, learning, assessment strategies that move beyond the more traditional constructs of a quiz or an exam. When I think of blended learning opportunities, students' positionality within the instructional design, student voice and choice, and educational experiences, this is a big area to press into. The work I had the opportunity to help support within Edmonton Catholic has been super helpful for me as dean in looking at our Center for Teaching Excellence. So we have an organization within the university here that really wants to better understand how to support our post-secondary instructors in terms of looking at assessment strategies, of looking at blended learning opportunities that move beyond perhaps some of the more traditional type of teaching approaches, but also to really help faculty and instructors understand that students are often their own best teacher as well. And how do we include to a greater degree those voices in the educational design and conversations and experiences?
Mm, I love that students are their best teacher, and uh, for me that comes up a lot in assessment research that I've been interacting with. Is we really live in that sweet spot of student learning and growth when we involve students into the assessment practice.
In conversation with Professor John Hattie about post-secondary and how we can look at elements of visible learning going forward. And he challenged me. He said, Tim, we're very good at articulating our philosophy of teaching, but what is our philosophy of learning? And I would say inherent to that learning must be the conversation of what is our philosophy of assessment. How
Mm.
do we know what students know, understand, and are able to do? And from an instructor level, how are we able then to have conversations and navigate those next steps so that the student is clearly aware of where they are and what they need to do, but also that the instructor can see the student through the lens of teacher and learner. And I think that's an opportunity at the post-secondary level that I'm really excited to have an opportunity to hopefully influence and add a little bit to those next steps.
A framework or a mindset shift in education here. When I went to high school, it was very much stand and deliver, and then you were expected to do. Since then, we've been working really hard on shifting those mindsets around it and shifting that, as you were saying, what is your assessment philosophy and how are you, what is your learning philosophy? But I know that that can be quite isolating or difficult to do. Within the context of education, with all the busyness that's going on right now, you have a new book out called Leader Ready, and I think by diving into leadership role in assessment and what you outline in this book, I think we can come to some understanding of how to better approach this systematically.
Yeah, so Leader Ready, and here it is. I'll be kind of ta-da. It really was a passion of wanting to really hear from aspiring leaders, from assistant principals, in terms of the leader quality standard, what they felt would be helpful to them to know, understand, and do to help them want to become principals. And so when we look at attrition data, we see that not only in Alberta, but across Canada, across most of the world for that matter, that fewer individuals are wanting to step into that mantle of principal and other leadership roles. We're seeing people who can retire on time whereas they might have been around for a few extra years. And so it's really incumbent upon us to understand the type of training, the type of experiences, how we unpack our professional standards, both as teachers and as leaders. And I think to a greater extent, we can be more intentional in shining some of the LQS on the TQS. So when we think of a classroom teacher, they lead a learning community. They are instructional leaders, yet that leadership is not necessarily appreciated or acknowledged in the teacher quality standard, whereas it's an absolute criteria in the leader quality standard. And so in Leader Ready, Vince and I talk about 4 pathways that we can bring some more consistent application of experiential learning to our aspiring leaders. We're leaving less to chance. You know, we've heard that famous expression, every student deserves a great teacher by design, not by chance. So too, I believe every school community deserves a great leader, not by chance, but by design. And so if we're looking at shortages that we're facing with teachers, as well as aspiring school leaders, it compounds the whole issue. So we need to go upstream to a greater extent and understand the types of environments that we need to create and establish um, to encourage aspiring leaders to want to come forward and take on these roles. So we spend a chapter talking about our practice standards and unpacking our standards as it's a common language, it's a through point, it gives us a baseline of what we should all know, understand, and be able to do. We then talk about an environment of implementation, so getting a sense of the feel of your school environment, the types of conversations we're having, elements of trust and respect, and how school leaders are required to model that to the greatest extent possible. So if you're going to build a level of trust and competence in your staff coming forward, school leadership really has to reflect those elements of openness and honesty and competency and being vulnerable and being just transparent in terms of where are we, where do we need to go, and how will we get there, and making sure that there's teacher voice and aspiring leader voice captured in some of the decisions. Because sometimes we have a lot of great intentions at a systems level, and sometimes we're just adding more things to the plate when really we should be de-implementing. And Peter DeWitt does a great job talking about de-implementation. Peter wrote the foreword for our book. And so we're asking, what can we take off of plates of teachers and administrators to really zero in on truly what matters and what's important? And so our third chapter really presses into guided leadership experiences. So this is where myself as a more knowledgeable other is working with aspiring leaders, and we look at the standards, and we've created that environment of trust and care, and we're actually looking at the skills, those fluencies, those competencies that the aspiring leader needs to know, understand, and be able to demonstrate. So we talk about a level 1, which is really a surface level. What can I read? What can I watch? Who can I talk to find out what that skill is? And then a level 2 experience is really that zone of proximal development, that gradual release of responsibility of, you know, I'm going to model this for you. You try it. Let's try it together. We know this works well with teaching our students in our classrooms. And sometimes we forget that it also will work with the adults. You know, so pedagogy for working with our children and younger students, andragogy, that how do adults want to learn and how do we work with their learning and their readiness to learn. And then finally, we look at celebrating mastery learning. That third level of learning is I have mastered or approached mastery of that concept. I can extend my learning into new contexts. I can also now be part of teaching other aspiring leaders at level 1 and 2. So really, it's a gradual release of responsibility model. And what we did is we just took the standards and we put some very real world practical problems and challenges that every aspiring leader should know, understand, and be able to do. And we've demonstrated what that might look like. And you know, very thankful that we have lots of opportunities now to work with other school divisions in terms of workshops and conferences and keynotes, and really celebrating that work of simply asking our aspiring leaders, and these are our teacher leaders in our midst, what do you feel would be helpful for your growth, for your development, to move you forward? And really, Julia, this is talking about our own self-efficacy. So we used Bandera's social cognitive learning theory as a framework for the book. And so when we think of our affective state, how do we feel? What's that baggage that we bring that impacts our dispositions, our attitudes to what needs to be done? To that social persuasion. What types of conversations are we having with our aspiring leaders? And how are we showing them, shining light on that path of, here's the trail of breadcrumbs that can lead to your success. We just invite you to come and to try and to do this, and ultimately to that vicarious learning into guided learning, and ultimately mastery. And Bandera from Alberta, really it was the voices of assistant principals in Edmonton Catholic Schools when I was doing my doctoral research. Then I broadened that, beyond DCSD out into the province and now into the States. I did some work with schools in Southern Oregon back in August. Vince and I just wrapped up a 4-part series with principals and aspiring leaders in Alaska. So there's a lot of interest in an approach to preparing leaders that really is practical, straightforward, and consistent. And I think that's kind of what's been missing in a lot of jurisdictions.
Thank you for sharing about the book. I want to circle back on what you were saying about self-efficacy, Bandura's understanding of that. And I think it starts building into that collective efficacy piece where once we have teachers or enough individuals within the building who believe in themselves and believe that they can affect change, how can we go into that world of collective efficacy to really move a learning community forward? And I think there's an intersection here between leadership and teacher leadership and assessment literacy within a school. Do you want to comment on how these concepts can help us develop assessment literate schools?
Yes, and that's a great point, because I think before we get to collective efficacy, which we know has a high impact size, and that's when everybody shares in that vision and has had an opportunity to see, from that assessment perspective of how do we know that we're moving the students forward to where they need to be? How are they demonstrating their fluency and their competency in progressing through those learning outcomes? So we backed it up a little bit. Before you can get to that collective efficacy, there is that sense of self-efficacy. So as the classroom teacher, what skills do I need to have? How do I work with my own professional knowledge, my own professional learning, my own professional development, in looking at a rich suite of capability for my own assessment strategies? We use formative and summative a lot. What does that really mean? And so the challenge is to not just talk about what we do. We can say, oh, we're an assessment ready school. What does that mean? What is the depth of your practice? And so we are suggesting that you can unpack specific skills. So how do you give feedback? How do you receive feedback? Not just sort of, here's 5 different types of feedback that we can give and try these. What's the actual impact that using these strategies will have in unlocking that learning and drawing out that learning, that students have more agency and more voice? We want students to be assessment ready. And that is a concept that really is top of mind for me right now in terms of pre-service teacher preparation at the university level. We will be sending our teachers to K-12 systems. What more might we do intentionally to better prepare, the tools in their backpacks before they come into the classrooms in our local school boards or wherever they will end up teaching around the world? And so there is always something that I'm a big fan of Regi Routman's Read, Write, Lead, and her work with school-wide literacy success. And when we talk about preparing leaders, I firmly believe that all leaders need to be leaders of literacy. And inherent to literacy writ large is assessment literacy, working with our teachers, understanding that there are different approaches in different ways that have varying degrees of impact. And we want to make sure that we're using the highest impact or the most impactful tools and strategies and approaches to teaching and learning. And we can't have high quality teaching and learning unless that's grounded or bracketed with a rich assessment regime. And I think that is often where there's not enough attention paid. And this is why I'm thankful to have an opportunity to talk to you about this. But as I said earlier, at the post-secondary level, we're perhaps a little more time stamped to older methodologies. That's not to say that there aren't some leading edge practices or very knowledgeable individuals who are really pressing into great assessment strategy. But I think if we kind of looked at more of a baseline, we have a lot of work to do in better understanding the student's role, and I'll say responsibility, but more so the opportunity for students to be more engaged in some of that assessment design. And whether that's co-construction of success criteria, looking at learner outcomes, looking at rubric, looking at what exemplary work looks like and how students will know what that means and what it looks like and when they've attained it. So these are the broader conversations that I'm excited to continue to press into at the post-secondary level. But as always, and as I said, we can't do it in isolation from K to 12. I've always felt there needs to be a greater handshake in teacher preparation, in leader preparation, in terms of understanding assessment.
This takes time. And if we're trying to build teacher efficacy towards assessment in silos, it's going to be very difficult to move that forward. So starting with that pre-service, creating those relationships to K to 12 and moving beyond. Could you comment on what you think some things that principals or assistant principals in schools could do to continue building that teacher efficacy in relation to assessment as pre-service teachers and new teachers are entering their school sites?
Yeah, and I think that really is the work ahead. And I think it's understanding that every pre-service teacher, every new teacher, and by new I mean in those first really 5 years, those are the formative years. We're still sharpening the saw, so to speak, in terms of the craft of teaching. And when we think of lesson planning, unit design, etc. And so I think we have to talk about scaling and sustainability. So I think from a leadership perspective is what are we asking our teachers to do? We know there are elements that are required by the province or the state in terms of perhaps some summative assessments or certain screeners. And so I think that the importance of building relationship with learners is paramount. That's job number one, so building those relationships, that demonstration of that safe, caring, respectful, and trust-filled environment. And I think school leaders have a huge role to play in creating those environments, because without that trust and respect, as I said, it's very difficult to move the hearts and minds of teachers forward to be open to new ideas and new possibilities. Second to that is those new ideas and new possibilities. We need to hear from our pre-service teachers, from our new teachers. We need to ask them, how are you feeling? What are you thinking? What are you wondering? What else do you feel might be helpful to move you forward? And they might not know what they don't know, but they might have a few really great ideas in terms of what we can do. Often we presume, oh, I've been at this 30 years, or, when I was a beginning teacher, I never got this. So you'll figure this out on your own. No, we need to stop that and bracket this is how we did it back in the day to here we are now, and what opportunities do we have? We have a lot of pre-service teachers who this is second, third career. They're bringing in a skill set, leadership attributes, knowledge base that sometimes we just take for granted and or worse, don't even ask about or acknowledge. So how do we leverage those skills, those attributes that they already bring? How do we shine some light? And again, shining LQS on the TQS. And I think, I'm going to get a t-shirt or a slogan made about shining LQS on TQS. I'm such a fan of actualizing teacher leadership because I see teachers as leaders. And as leaders, that includes that responsibility for, again, that philosophy of teaching, of learning, of assessment. And I think from the perspective of what more can school leadership do to support this, we've got to be mindful of simple things. I don't mean simple, but more practical in terms of like digital equity. Do our students have the tools that they need? Do they have access to internet? We learned a lot of lessons post-pandemic of equity in education. When we think of looking at the evolution of teaching and learning, we still have to be mindful of critical thinking and communication and collaboration and all those skills inherent to unpacking the outcomes from the program of studies. And so, we also cannot lose sight of the non-cognitive and social emotional skill development of our students. So leadership really needs to see that holistic approach. It's not just, okay, I've got X number of students in class and we can pay the bills or we have enough money to run the school. I do think that, we put a lot of the running a business aspect into administration, and we can never lose sight that first and foremost, our principals, our assistant principals, our leaders, our teachers, our instructional leaders, our assessment leaders, our, relational leaders, all the attributes of the LQS. So it's a tall order, but I think we have to give ourselves permission to see the teaching and learning and understand that at the center of any decision we make as the leader, we should be seeing students. And how are we supporting students in classrooms and their families as stakeholders of that journey? And ultimately, the robust adults in our buildings, where it's multidisciplinary teams, custodial, our bus drivers, the whole community raises these children. And I think that's something we need to never lose sight of is, at the heart of what we do, we have to assess what we're putting in place, what we're trying to implement, at the micro and the macro and the meso of making sure we're not losing sight of who we're serving. And that's why it's so important to hear the voices of all stakeholders, particularly students and staff in educational conversations.
Yeah, I'm loving that point of having that holistic view of education and finding that way to unite all the different parts and moving parts of education centered in the student. The student is why we're there. And I think assessment literacy and assessment pedagogy is a great venue to start uniting all of these pieces, uniting numeracy, literacy, um, health and well-being, and how can we track what we're doing? How do we know that it's impacting students in a positive way? And bringing in that equity piece, how do we know that our practices are equitable to all of the students in our building?
Yeah, and you said the word there, the impact. How do we know what we're doing is actually helpful, is actually moving that learning forward? And I think at a fundamental level, those are the questions we should be asking about any initiative, any new product, any new tool is this going to help students be more successful? How will we know from a systems level, from the school leadership level, from the classroom level? How are we communicating that to parents and other really important educational partners and stakeholders in terms of what's working or what's not working? And I think that then gives pause to our trustees, elected officials, to advocate for what we truly need to create greater levels of teaching and learning. And so, sometimes, things get politicized, and that's just the nature of politics. But we can never lose sight that it's students at the center of these decisions, and that's why our critical, professional, reasoned judgment is so critical. And I would like to see more of that actualized in K to 12 and in post-secondary in terms of, again, that handshake, those partner conversations about how are we better preparing our teachers today for what we need them to be able to know, understand, and do tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. I think that's so important, relying on our professional judgment to really help guide us in these decisions and in assessing what is bringing the biggest impact to student learning. And I think it goes back to what we were talking about self-efficacy. If we don't have self-efficacy, if we don't believe that we can as professionals, it is going to be quite difficult to exercise professional judgment.
Yeah, I think whenever I'm traveling on a plane and we hear the airline attendant when they're doing the safety demo is, if an oxygen mask drops, put your own on first. And that just seems so counterintuitive to teachers, to educators, because we want to serve and do for others first. But again, self-efficacy is making sure we're our best self, that we're in that mind frame, that mindset that we're here to serve and do. Bracketing personal bias. We all bring, our own affective baggage with us every day, and you can't just say, hey, put on a happy face and do your best. We need to do better than that in terms of attracting more people into teaching and into leadership. And I think it's through, looking at our standards, looking at that environment for implementation, looking at those guided and really hands-on how to do it, how to find success, and then celebrating that. Again, those are the 4 pathways in Leader Ready, which extend to teacher readiness, pre-service teacher readiness. You can look at principal readiness. You can look at systems leadership readiness. The concepts there of, Bandura's social cognitive learning theory, I think can apply to any field, to help improve the practice of what we need to do for the betterment of the learning in our respective organizations.
Well, this has been an awesome conversation so far, and I think we're coming to the end of the episode. So before we leave off, are there any upcoming sessions, professional development, or projects that you are working on?
Yeah, so right now we're working on our next project. So we're getting a couple of book proposals together. And so we're very excited for those coming opportunities. So as I said, really to look at an extension of the leader readiness piece to see how we might work more intentionally with aspiring teachers, but also to look at systems levels in terms of how we can really look at the nature of what we're doing it, why we're doing it, and how we can do things with greater impact and effect. I'll be presenting at GETCA in March, so really excited to have an opportunity to talk to our Edmonton area teachers. And then we're lining up for additional podcasts, blog posts, and opportunities we have for some keynoting and presentations leading up to the annual Visible Learning Conference by Corwin, which will be in San Diego in July. So lots going on, and we're just really thankful and excited to be able to talk about great teaching, learning, and yes, assessment with everybody who will listen.
Perfect. And I'll link your Corwin website in the description for this episode so that people can check that out and follow along with some of these things that you're putting out.
Wonderful.
And
Thanks.
no worries. Our last question is quite a big question, so take it in whichever direction you want to take it. But what is a dream that you have for education?
That's I have many dreams, but I think when I read about educational systems around the world, or I kind of zero in on what's happening kind of in Finland and Norway for the simple reason of the esteem to which educators, teachers are held by those respective societies. I think in some way there needs to be a bit of a reclamation of the teaching profession in North America. We take our K to 12 and often our post-secondary institutions for granted. I don't think that's good enough anymore. I think we're facing teacher shortages, leader shortages. So, and it's not just about wages and classroom conditions, so those are factors. But fundamentally, I think this is what value do we as a society place on a comprehensive competency and skill-based curriculum, critical thinking. We want discerning, well-informed, compassionate citizens that we're forming. So I think now more than ever, we need our students to be equipped for their future, not what we think we needed from our past, but where they're going. So my dream really is to see a greater celebration of K to 12 in Alberta, to really affirm the important role that our teachers play day to day in shaping the hearts and minds of our students. So that's a big dream. So I just think really that reclamation of teaching and learning and the respect and the level of I guess the level of I'm really struggling for the word. I think that level of appreciation for what education really is intended and meant to be. And so I think we lost a little bit of the sight of that because of COVID and pandemic. And my real dream is we can find the tools, the resources, the supports, the professional learning to really close gaps and really promote that love of lifelong learning with everybody. And I think that's really the big piece for me is that we're called to be lifelong learners, and that is something that I really hope that everybody will latch on to.
Mm-hmm. What a wonderful dream to have. And thank you so much for sharing your perspective on this and for the depth of conversation that we've had today. Thank you so much again for being on the podcast today, Tim, and I'm sure we will hear from you soon.
Thank you very much, Julia, and I appreciate all that you're doing to further these excellent conversations.
Grading for equity. In Grading for Equity, Joe Feldman challenges educators to reevaluate traditional grading practices and embrace a more equitable approach. So Feldman provides a practical guide that not only critiques current systems, but also offers actionable solutions for fostering fair and motivating assessment environments. The strength of the book lies in its commitment to practicality. Feldman doesn't just critique, he introduces the concept of grading for equity, encouraging educators to separate academic achievement from non-academic factors. This approach aims to minimize the influence of external elements, promoting a more accurate representation of student understanding. Feldman engages with the psychological aspects of grading, exploring how assessment impacts student motivation and self-perception. This focus on the holistic student experience is particularly relevant in today's educational landscape. The book provides practical tools and strategies for immediate implementation, from reassessing grading categories to adopting outcomes-based grading. Feldman's suggestions are both bold and actionable. This hands-on approach makes Grading for Equity an invaluable resource for teachers seeking to effect positive change in their classrooms. Moreover, Feldman's work is rooted in a commitment to social justice. He's urging educators to recognize and address systemic inequalities within their grading practices. This makes Grading for Equity not just a guide for fair assessment, but a call to action for educators to champion equity within their classrooms. Grading for Equity is an essential read for teachers aiming to create fair and motivating learning environments. Feldman's blend of insightful critique, practical strategies, and a commitment to social justice makes this book a valuable addition to any educator's toolkit.
As we wrap up today's agenda, a heartfelt gratitude goes out to Dr. Tim Cusack for sharing his expertise. And to you, our dedicated listeners. Stay connected with us on Instagram at ECSD Learning, and don't forget to subscribe for updates on future episodes. We hope that today's episode sparks inspiration for meaningful connections in education and encourages a thoughtful approach to assessment practices. As you continue your journey of growth, may you find fulfillment and impactful connections. Thank you for tuning in to the Learning Curve podcast with Edmonton Catholic Schools.